This reflection will be based on the first 3 sections of Chapter 2, You Cannot Love What Shocks You, pages 21 through 27. Now, right off the bat, Monsignor says that this work we're doing, for us, this reading and trying to understand Cry of the Heart, is about seeing in a new way. And he says this new way of looking at suffering is the uniqueness that the world desperately needs. So he believes we're doing something good by trying to wrestle with this. So even reading this book is about learning this new way of looking at suffering, and this way of seeing will help us to respond to what is otherwise a deeply mistaken approach to dealing with human suffering. It's right there on page 21. That deeply mistaken approach is going to be referred to a little later as tenderness. A little confusing, but he's borrowing from Walker Percy's critique of the world's way of seeing. But since tenderness is thought to be quite a good thing, obviously something's going on here. So this is where we have to be willing to move into a new way of even using some of these words. So let's look at some examples from Monsignor. The first is from that story of Nathaniel Hawthorne, the birthmark. And we read that the man Aylmer has a wife, Georgiana, and that Aylmer reveals to her that he finds her birthmark shocking. And she cries to him, "My husband, you cannot love what shocks you." And it turns out that this story is somewhat autobiographical. We learn that Hawthorne himself struggled with the same problem of being repulsed by certain forms of suffering. In fact, his story, Our Old Home, about the fastidious Englishman who was followed by a wretched child who reached out its hideous arms to the man to be held, is a story of something that happened to him. Now, he did pick that child up, as we read on the top of page 25, but the event revealed to him that he has a spiritual problem, even if he didn't fully understand it. Monsignor writes about him, he knew he had to accept the child as he was. As with most authors, it was easier for Hawthorne to look at himself through the characters he would create. And we can hear then the way he reflects on this, his own experience, in the words he used to describe the event in Our Old Home. You can see this quoted on page 24. "So I watched the struggle in his mind with a good deal of interest," he writes, "and am seriously of the opinion that he did an heroic act, and effected more than he dreamed of towards his final salvation, when he took up the loathsome child and caressed it as tenderly as if he had been its father." Now, this story reminds me of the one told by another young man who, when visiting with Mother Teresa, simply to observe her, I think he was a reporter, he was told by her to pick up a man who was lying in his own waste on the side of the street. He says, I'm just here to take pictures. And then whatever else was conveyed by the look of Mother Teresa, he does pick up the man. Reluctantly. And they got home, or brought the man back to one of the homes, and Mother asked that the man be bathed. And again, the guy does it reluctantly. He was even using a long-handled brush to avoid having to really touch the man directly. But then, for love's sake, he did roll up his sleeves, and he touched the man, washing him, carefully. The story goes on to say that this man said he saw Christ in the man, and that when he ran to tell Mother Teresa, she saw him and asked him first, "Did you see him?" But I think Flannery O'Connor would kind of critique that kind of pious recalling of an event. But whatever the details of the exchange, that man knew and came to understand, which is why he tells the story, that you cannot love what shocks you. And like Hawthorne, he knew he had to accept the man as he was. Now let's go to the main point of this really great section entitled, "The Good is Always Under Construction." This is where Albacete connects all of what we've been doing so far. Unless you knew of it already, we learned in Cry of the Heart that Nathaniel Hawthorne's daughter Rose started a community of religious sisters called the Servants for the Relief of Incurable Cancer. And she shared with the Catholic author Flannery O'Connor that the community was really founded on her father's experience of overcoming his shock that day and that repulsion, and then moving into love. So Hawthorne's daughter said that her sisters were shocked at nothing and spent their whole lives making comfortable those who had been pronounced incurable of cancer. Now this is from Monsignor, and this stands out to me. It's right there halfway down page 25. "I think," he says, "the refusal to be shocked or repulsed in the face of suffering is the calling of every Christian. We have to reach out to those who suffer with a profound acceptance of their agony instead of seeking to remove or destroy their experience. I'll share with you here again how we brought those students every summer to Peru to serve in a home for children who were sick and dying. And most of them were from the mountains and couldn't afford to live near the city of Lima where the home was located. Some children had parents who would try to visit them, but many were abandoned, orphaned, because of the severity of their illness and the offensiveness of their condition, their outward appearance. I was never more proud of our students than when they would take these children into their arms, unafraid of their otherwise frightening conditions. And every year, a few of our students would even prefer to draw near to the children who were most severely deformed. It was amazing, really. And I think we all might have helped one another, even emboldened one another, to overcome the shock that would have kept us at a distance from the children. And one of the teachers with whom I shared this experience over the years, the one who really started and led the mission trip, was always fond of telling the story of a student of ours whom he overheard saying to a child with no arms and no legs, "You're perfect, you're perfect." And that image of this high school student from Long Island saying to this little boy, "You're perfect," helps me to understand what Albacete is saying on page 26 when he's reflecting on Flannery O'Connor having said something like, "The face of good, like in us, is grotesque. Good in us," she says, "is always something under construction." And, Monsignor continues, "When confronted with the shocking, the task should be to use it to construct good rather than to eliminate it. In this way, we make something good in the midst of imperfection." Like the transformation that can happen in us. That's the main point of this section we're reflecting on. The good in us is deformed, and things that shock us can serve to form or reform that love, that good in us, which is always under construction. That make sense? It is we who are deformed, the love in us, and the reason we are so often offended by what shocks us is because we experience it like a painful treatment undergone by our soul. Monsignor ends the section quoting Flannery O'Connor, who's reflecting on the funeral mass for that little girl, Marianne, who died of cancer at 12 years old after living in one of the homes run by the community of Hawthorne's daughter. But it's really those last lines that are just so important for us to hear again, even after reading them. Popular pity would have us mark our gain in sensibility and the loss of vision. If other ages felt less, they saw more, even though they saw with the blind, prophetical, unsentimental eye of acceptance, which is to say, of faith. In this absence of this faith now, we govern by tenderness, but it is a tenderness which, long since cut off from the person of Christ, is detached from the source of tenderness. And its logical outcome is terror. That's how we began this whole thing. We mentioned, like, the Holocaust. These Enlightenment values, when they're uprooted from Christ, who gives birth to things like freedom and rights and dignity, and when they're detached from the source of tenderness, its logical outcome is terror. This is why Monsignor Albacete quoted Walker Percy at the beginning of this section, who wrote, "Tenderness leads to the gas chamber." Because we justify trying to eliminate suffering by eliminating those who are suffering. That's what goes on. It's the good in us that needs to be reformed. The good in us, the love in us, and it is the suffering of others that reforms this love in us. So unless we allow the suffering of others to reform our hearts, that deformed presence of love within us, we will pride ourselves in our ability to suppress and eliminate suffering, but we will not have learned to love. We'll continue studying the second chapter, You Cannot Love What Shocks You, proceeding from pages 27 through 31 of Albacete's Cry of the Heart in the next reflection.